The heavy autumn afternoon air hung thick and uncomfortably quiet over the small, weather-beaten town of Oakhaven, nestled deep in the rolling hills of Virginia. Inside the aging Vance home, the faint golden light filtering through the lace curtains barely illuminated the living room where Inez stood. Her hands were tightly clasped together, her fingers white from the pressure, as if she were desperately trying to hold inside a storm that threatened to break her apart. Across the room, her cousin Valeria spoke without bothering to lower her voice. Every word she uttered was steeped in blatant contempt, especially whenever she brought up the man she was supposed to marry. Valeria paced the worn hardwood floor, tossing her head back with a cold laugh. She declared that the man was completely blind, that he could barely move on his own, and that marrying him would be nothing short of taking on a lifelong, suffocating burden. She did not speak with a shred of pity or empathy. Her voice carried a icy sharpness that bordered on outright mockery. Sitting in a high-backed armchair nearby, Aunt Gloria listened in silence. She did not interrupt Valeria or scold her for her cruelty. Instead, after a long, agonizing pause, the older woman made a decision with an eerie calmness that felt far more terrifying than any raised voice ever could. If Valeria refused to go through with the arrangement, Gloria announced, then Inez would take her place and marry him instead. The words hung frozen in the cool autumn air. Inez did not respond right away. For as long as she could remember, she had been groomed by life to occupy the empty spaces nobody else wanted. Ever since her mother passed away 5 years ago, everything in that house had gradually ceased to belong to her. Piece by piece, her mother's belongings had disappeared from the shelves, rooms had been repurposed, and her own voice had been systematically erased until she was little more than a shadow in her own home. Even the one thing her mother had protected with her life, a small, dark oil painting that had always seemed far more valuable than its humble wooden frame suggested, had vanished without a single word of explanation months ago. "I will do it," Inez said finally, her voice low, steady, and barely above a whisper. Valeria let out a short, sharp laugh that cut through the room like a razor blade. Aunt Gloria simply gave a singular, curt nod, as though the entire matter had been orchestrated and decided months before this moment ever arrived. That very same evening, a dark sedan pulled into the gravel driveway, announcing the arrival of the wealthy Vance family from Richmond. When the front door opened, Adrian Vance appeared in the doorway, ushering in a quiet so profound it felt as though the entire house held its breath. He sat in a sleek, specialized wheelchair, wearing dark, polished glasses that completely concealed his eyes. His face was extraordinarily calm, devoid of any visible anger or self-pity. There was no obvious physical weakness in his posture, yet there was no arrogance either. He possessed an unsettling, immovable stillness that was incredibly difficult to read. His movements were calculated, slow, and precise, as if he navigated the world through a heightened sense of awareness that did not rely on standard sight. When he finally spoke, his voice was smooth, deep, and measured. He did not raise his tone, nor did he show any sign of impatience. It was as though nothing in his immediate surroundings had the power to disturb his internal equilibrium. The conversation between the two families was brief and strictly transactional. An old family agreement was cited, polite yet hollow glances were exchanged across the room, and everyone waited for a final confirmation that was already a foregone conclusion. Inez surveyed the familiar living room one last time. No one in that room looked at her as a human being capable of making her own choices. To them, she was merely a convenient, disposable solution to an uncomfortable problem. "I accept," Inez stated clearly, lifting her head to meet the gaze of everyone in the room. but I will not leave this house without what rightfully belongs to me." The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. Valeria narrowed her eyes in sudden annoyance, while Aunt Gloria let out a heavy, displeased sigh. "I only want my mother's painting," Inez added, holding her ground without flinching. "Nothing more, nothing less." A tense, heavy silence settled over the room. Inez was not asking for money, land, or family heirlooms. She was asking only for the single memory of her mother that had been stolen from her, even if she suspected they had already sold it off or hidden it away long ago. After a moment of visible reluctance, Aunt Gloria gave a dismissive wave of her hand, agreeing to the term just to settle the matter. The wedding that followed 2 days later was brief, devoid of warmth, and completely stripped of any genuine sentiment. There were no flowers, no soft music, and no heartfelt vows, only the scratching of pens on official marriage documents, empty gestures, and the heavy thud of a front door closing behind her. When Inez stepped out onto the porch, leaving behind the house that had been her prison for years, the crisp Virginia mountain air brushed against her face. Adrian was waiting for her near the passenger side of the car. He did not say anything at first, but as her footsteps approached, he turned his head toward her with an exactness that felt far too precise to be mere coincidence. "Are you ready to leave?" he asked softly, his voice carrying a gentle warmth that startled her. Inez looked at him in silence, studying the strong jawline and the quiet composure of the man beside her. He was nothing like the fragile, broken invalid her family had painted him out to be. "Yes," she answered quietly. But deep down in her heart, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. This forced marriage was not the end of her hardships, but the opening chapter of a completely unpredictable journey. The Vance estate on the outskirts of Richmond was not merely vast. It possessed a distinct, profound quietness that felt entirely different from the suffocating silence of her childhood home. The quiet here did not crush the spirit. Instead, it seemed to create space for a person to breathe freely. When Inez crossed the grand threshold of the house for the very first time, the first thing she noticed was not the undeniable luxury of the marble floors or the high ceilings, but a strange, long-forgotten sense of tranquility. Nobody was raising their voice, no one was arguing in another room, and no eyes followed her movements with resentment or judgment. An elderly man dressed in a neat conservative suit approached her with a respectful, slight bow of his head. "Welcome home, Mrs. Vance," he said warmly. "My name is Thomas. May I offer you a hot cup of coffee or tea?" Inez hesitated for a fraction of a second. She was simply not accustomed to having anyone offer her comfort without expecting something in return. Nevertheless, she gave a polite, quiet nod. A few minutes later, the rich, inviting aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the grand hall. It was a remarkably small gesture, yet it was more than enough to make her feel, for the first time in many years, that someone actually cared about her well-being. Adrian moved slowly through the spacious living room, guiding his wheelchair with effortless grace. He did not appear disoriented, nor did he display the slightest hint of hesitation. Every turn he made was remarkably precise, as though he mapped out the environment using an internal compass that had nothing to do with physical sight. "Your room has been fully prepared upstairs," Adrian said, breaking the silence with his calm, even voice. Inez turned to him, slightly caught off guard. "My room?" she repeated. "Yes," he replied simply. "I thought it would be far more comfortable for both of us if we had our own spaces." Soothe? There was no hidden pressure behind his words, no underlying expectation, and no demand for affection. It was a straightforward, respectful gesture of consideration, yet his distance disarmed her far more than hostility ever could have. The bedroom assigned to her was large, filled with natural light, and featured soft linen curtains that swayed gently in the late afternoon breeze. Through the wide glass windows, she could look out over a quiet, tree-lined street, where locals walked their dogs at a leisurely pace, as if time itself had slowed down to a peaceful crawl. On a small mahogany side table sat a vase of fresh, vibrant wildflowers. They were not expensive or showy, but they had clearly been arranged with genuine thought and delicate care. Inez set her modest suitcase down near the edge of the plush bed and walked slowly around the perimeter of the room. She ran her fingertips gently across the smooth wooden furniture, tracing the soft fabric of the armchair and taking in the unfamiliar surroundings. Everything was in its rightful place, and for the very first time in half a decade, she felt as though she might finally belong somewhere too. Later that evening, the estate remained peacefully quiet. It was not a heavy or uncomfortable silence, but the kind of stillness that invites quiet reflection and deep thought. Later on, Adrian sent word asking if she would join him in the main study. It was not a command or a formal request, but a simple invitation that she readily chose to accept. They sat across from one another near a crackling fireplace, maintaining a polite and respectful distance. There was no immediate warmth or intimacy between them, but there was no animosity either. They existed in a delicate, fragile state of truce, both tacitly understanding that they were entering into an arrangement that had yet to take its final shape. I believe it is best if we are completely honest with each other about our situation, Adrian began, his hands resting quietly in his lap. Inez nodded in agreement, watching him closely. This marriage had clearly not been a romantic choice for either of them. His voice was firm and resolute, yet completely devoid of harshness or self-pity. "We can make this very simple for both of us," Adrian continued calmly. "We agree to 1 year of absolute mutual respect. We fulfill whatever public expectations our families require of us, and once the 12 months have passed, we can both quietly go our separate ways." His words hung in the air between them, crisp, clear, and unembellished by false promises. Inez took a slow, deep breath, letting the reality of his proposal sink in. "1 year," she repeated softly. "And after that?" "After that, you will have your complete freedom," he said, turning his dark glasses slightly in her direction. "I will not interfere in your personal life or your future, and I certainly do not expect you to burden yourself with mine." Inez lowered her gaze, contemplating the offer. It was a far better deal than anything she could have ever hoped for back in Oakhaven. "Agreed," she answered firmly. With those few words, their unspoken contract was sealed without the need for further debate. As Inez stood up to retreat to her bedroom for the night, a young housemaid crossed the dimly lit hallway. The woman did not stop or offer a greeting. Instead, she kept her head down as she passed Adrian, actively avoiding eye contact before quickly slipping through a side door into the servant quarters. Inez barely registered the interaction at the time. That night, as she lay down in the oversized bed, the silence of the house no longer felt foreign or threatening to her. The mattress was incredibly comfortable. The sheets were cool and soft against her skin, and the darkness outside held no looming dread. She closed her eyes slowly, but amidst the deep peace of the room, a persistent, burning question began to form in her mind. Why would a man like Adrian Vance, with all his wealth and stature, agree to a marriage like this without demanding anything in return? And for the very first time, that uncertainty did not fill her with fear. It sparked a deep, undeniable curiosity. The morning routine at the Vance estate unfolded in a manner that was entirely alien to everything Inez had known before. There were no loud, frantic footsteps echoing in the hallways, no slamming doors, and no bitter arguments breaking out over breakfast. There was only the gentle, soothing hum of the coffee maker and the soft morning sunlight streaming through the tall kitchen windows. Inez stood by the granite kitchen counter, watching the steam rise slowly from a mug of freshly poured coffee. She was not entirely sure why she had dragged herself out of bed so early, but a quiet voice deep inside her urged her to understand this new world step by step. "You really do not need to do that yourself, you know?" A smooth voice called out behind her. Inez turned around quickly to see Adrian standing near the archway, leaning lightly against the back of a dining chair. He was not wearing his dark glasses this morning, revealing striking, deep-set eyes that remained fixed slightly downward, as though he were deliberately avoiding focusing too directly on any single point in the room. "I know," Inez replied softly, holding the warm mug with both hands. "I just wanted to—" She trailed off, struggling to find the right words to articulate her thoughts. "To feel like you are actually a part of this house, rather than just a guest?" Adrian offered gently, filling in the silence for her. Inez looked at him, genuinely surprised by his intuition. "Yes," she admitted quietly. "I suppose that is exactly what I was trying to do." Adrian gave a subtle nod of understanding. "Then do not start by serving others," he said with a quiet authority. "Start by simply living in it." The words were remarkably simple, yet they left a far deeper impression on her heart than he likely intended. During breakfast, their conversation remained light and easy. They spoke of mundane, everyday things, the unseasonably warm Virginia weather, the peaceful surroundings of the estate, and the distant, muffled sounds of the city that barely managed to reach their quiet neighborhood. There was no awkward tension, nor was there any forced closeness between them. It was a comfortable, easy stillness that was rapidly becoming her new normal. However, that fragile sense of security was abruptly shattered. A sharp, loud crash echoed from the upper floor, sending a jolt of panic through the quiet house. Inez gasped, dropping her fork as her head snapped upward toward the ceiling. "What on earth was that?" she asked, her heart pounding against her ribs. Adrian did not answer immediately. Instead, he turned his head with remarkable speed and uncanny precision toward the exact origin of the noise upstairs, as if he had pinpointed its location without the slightest effort. "It was likely nothing major," he said smoothly, though his voice had turned noticeably cooler. "But we should certainly have someone check on it." Thomas rushed upstairs to investigate, returning a few minutes later with a brief, somewhat unconvincing explanation. A heavy ceramic planter had apparently fallen off the second-story balcony ledge and shattered on the hardwood floor below. Inez frowned, looking between Thomas and her husband. "Did it just fall on its own?" she questioned, skepticism clear in her voice. "There isn't any wind this morning." Thomas hesitated for a brief second, clearing his throat nervously. "It appears so, ma'am. It must have been placed too close to the edge." Inez was far from convinced. There was something in the way Adrian remained completely silent, perfectly still and hyper-alert, that suggested he had perceived far more about the incident than anyone else in the room was willing to admit. Later that afternoon, needing a break from the lingering tension in the house, Inez left the estate for the first time to meet her oldest friend, Sarah, at a small, cozy cafe near downtown Richmond. The air inside smelled wonderfully of roasted espresso beans and fresh cinnamon pastries. Elderly couples sat at corner tables speaking in hushed, friendly tones, while the rest of the world seemed to pass by at a comfortable distance. "So, you are actually living in a massive, historic mansion now?" Sarah said with a light chuckle, setting her teacup down on the saucer. Honestly, Inez, that does not sound like a terrible life at all. Inez looked down at her coffee, swirling the liquid around in her cup. It isn't about the money or the house, Sarah. Then what is it? Sarah asked, her expression turning serious. It is just too quiet, Inez admitted after a long pause. It is so peaceful that it makes me completely paranoid. I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop. Sarah leaned forward, resting her elbows on the wooden table. Peace can be real, Inez. Not everything in life has to be a trap. But tell me, what is he really like? Is he hiding something? Inez hesitated, her mind racing back to the way Adrian had reacted to the crash earlier that morning. I don't know, she whispered. I have this overwhelming feeling that Adrian is not at all who he pretends to be. Sarah raised an eyebrow in curiosity. In what way? He doesn't act like a man who is lost or helpless, Inez explained, trying to find the right words. He moves with this quiet confidence. It is almost as if he understands far more about his surroundings than anyone gives him credit for. Sarah leaned back in her chair, taking a moment to digest the information. Men with real power always keep secrets, Inez. And it isn't always out of malice. Sometimes it is out of self-preservation. Inez nodded slowly, acknowledging the truth in her friend's words. I also need to figure out how to retrieve something important, she added, her voice dropping lower. The painting? Sarah asked gently. Inez looked up, her eyes filled with a mixture of determination and sorrow. Yes, my mother's last artwork. If Aunt Gloria sold it to someone connected to the Vance family, it has to be somewhere in their network. It is the only thing I have left that actually feels like it belongs to me. While Inez was away at the cafe, the atmosphere inside the Vance estate grew decidedly dark. Deep inside his private study, Adrian sat behind a massive oak desk. Near the door stood the young housemaid Inez had noticed the night before. She pretended to be busy wiping down a display case, but her eyes were darting nervously toward the desk, paying far too much attention to what was happening in the room. She did not speak, nor did she make a sound, before quietly slipping out into the corridor. Inside the study, Adrian's most trusted security advisor, a tall, stern man named Marcus, spoke in a low, controlled voice. We cross-referenced the employment records just as you asked, sir. The new housemaid, Maya, did not get hired here by coincidence. Adrian did not flinch or move a muscle. Has it been confirmed? Yes, Marcus replied grimly. She has been in frequent coded communication with an outside party tied directly to your late father's former business partners, the ones who lost their board seats during the restructuring. A heavy, suffocating silence filled the study. So we are not as alone in this house as we would like to believe, Adrian said, his voice dropping an octave. No, sir. We are definitely being watched from the inside. Adrian rested his chin on his hand, contemplating his next move with icy calculation. Do not terminate her employment yet, he instructed calmly. I want to know precisely who is pulling her strings, and whether she is reporting directly to him. To whom, sir? Marcus inquired. Adrian took a slow breath before answering. To the man who has been patiently waiting for 5 long years for me to make a single, fatal mistake. When Inez returned home later that evening, the estate looked exactly as she had left it, pristine, quiet, and perfectly organized. Yet, the air felt noticeably heavier. As she walked down the long, carpeted hallway toward her room, her eyes caught sight of a door that had been left slightly ajar. She had passed this corridor a dozen times before, but she had never noticed this particular room. She paused, looking up and down the empty hallway. Hearing no one around, she placed her hand gently against the heavy wood and pushed the door open. The interior was shrouded in semi-darkness. Sheets covered several pieces of antique furniture. Old framed artwork leaned against the walls, and the air smelled heavily of forgotten time and dust. Inez took a cautious step inside, but the moment her foot crossed the threshold, a sudden chill ran down her spine. She knew instantly that she was not alone in the room. The sleek, modern offices of Vance Enterprises in downtown Richmond operated at a rhythm that could not have been more different from the quiet solitude of the family estate. There was no serene peace here. The atmosphere was charged with intense, relentless activity. Telephones rang off the hook, keyboards clacked continuously, and executives moved purposefully through the glass hallways, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. When Inez stepped out of the private elevator for her first day as an administrative assistant, she immediately felt dozens of eyes locking onto her. The looks were not openly hostile, but they were deeply inquisitive and skeptical, as if everyone in the building were silently trying to figure out why a girl from a small mountain town was standing beside the company's enigmatic heir. Inez kept her chin up and her back perfectly straight, holding on to the words Adrian had spoken to her earlier. Start by living, not serving. Still, a wave of profound insecurity threatened to wash over her. Adrian walked beside her with his signature unyielding composure. As he entered the main floor, he issued crisp, precise instructions to department heads without ever needing to raise his voice. Nobody interrupted him, nobody questioned his authority, and certainly no one dared to treat him as a weak or incapable man. He controlled the room entirely through the sheer weight of his presence. "This will be your workspace," Adrian said, gesturing toward a sleek desk situated just outside his private office. "You will be handling project archives, scheduling, and meeting preparation. We will start with the basic operations." Inez took a seat, smoothing down her skirt. "I will do my absolute best," she assured him. "I know you will," he replied softly. "That is all I ask." "Well, well, isn't this just a heartwarming sight?" A sharp, overly polished voice sneered from behind them. Valeria stepped out of the secondary conference room, looking impeccably dressed in a tailored suit. Her unexpected presence immediately altered the dynamic of the floor. She glided toward them with absolute confidence, though her eyes betrayed a bitter, simmering resentment. She stopped right in front of Inez's desk, looking down at her with unfiltered condescension. From playing the dutiful maid at home to sitting at a desk in a corporate headquarters, Valeria said, not bothering to lower her voice. My, Inez, what an extraordinary promotion for someone like you." Several nearby employees quickly lowered their heads, pretending to focus on their work while hanging on every word. Inez felt the sting of the insult cut deep, but she took a slow breath and refused to let her emotions show. "I am here to do a job, Valeria," Inez replied with remarkable calm. "Nothing more." Valeria let out a bitter, quiet laugh. "Of course you are. Though let's be honest, sweetie, nobody in this building actually believes you earned this seat on merit. You are only here because of a convenient family arrangement." The cruel remark hovered in the air long after Valeria turned on her heel and walked away. The next few hours passed in a blur of tedious tasks. Inez threw herself into organizing high-priority project files and cross-referencing meeting schedules, desperately trying to prove her worth and tune out the whispers of her coworkers. But just as she was beginning to find her rhythm, chaos erupted across the department. "Where are the core architectural files for the Riverfront Development Project?" a senior manager shouted, frantically pacing between desks. The presentation to the city board is in 2 hours. Who had those files last? A tense, uncomfortable silence fell over the office. Employees began exchanging nervous glances until one of the junior clerks stepped forward, pointing an accusing finger directly at Inez's desk. Inez was the one consolidating the archive folders this morning, the clerk claimed nervously. She was the last person handling those digital files. Inez's heart dropped into her stomach as every head in the department turned to glare at her. She stood up immediately, her hands trembling slightly, but her voice remaining remarkably firm. I organized those files into the main server folder exactly as I was instructed, she stated clearly. I did not delete or misplace anything. Valeria re-emerged from her office, folding her arms across her chest, with a smug, satisfied smirk on her face. What an unbelievable coincidence, Valeria remarked loudly. Her very first day on the job, and our most critical municipal project gets completely compromised. I suppose we shouldn't be surprised. Inez felt the crushing weight of public suspicion suffocating her, but she refused to bow her head in defeat this time. If something is missing from the server, we will trace the access logs and find it, she declared, looking Valeria dead in the eye. Adrian stepped out of his corner office, his presence immediately silencing the rising panic in the room. He remained quiet for a few seconds, as if processing every piece of information and analyzing the subtle shifts in the room's energy. We will proceed with the city presentation, as scheduled, Adrian announced calmly, his voice echoing through the open floor. The senior manager looked utterly baffled. Sir, with all due respect, how can we present without the primary architectural blueprints and specs? Adrian turned slightly toward Inez's direction. Inez has an alternative concept, don't you? Inez froze, caught entirely off guard. It is just a rough preliminary sketch I was working on during lunch, she stammered nervously. Show it to us, Adrian commanded gently. With every eye in the building locked onto her, Inez took a deep breath, pulled out her sketchbook, and stepped up to the main digital display. As she began to speak, her nervousness slowly melted away, replaced by a deep, genuine passion for design. She explained her vision for the riverfront project, focusing on open, light-filled spaces, sustainable local materials, and residential layouts designed to offer families a true sense of safety, warmth, and community, rather than just imposing luxury. When she finished her presentation, the room remained dead silent for several agonizing seconds. That concept, the senior manager finally spoke up, his eyes wide with genuine admiration, is significantly better than the original blueprints. It actually gives the project a soul. That is precisely what we will present to the board today, Adrian declared decisively. Valeria's face flushed with deep embarrassment and rage. Adrian, you cannot possibly be serious. You are going to trust a novice's casual drawings over months of professional planning. Adrian did not bother looking in her direction. The decision has been made. Everyone back to work. Late that afternoon, after the city presentation turned out to be a resounding success, Marcus entered Adrian's private office and closed the heavy door behind him. We ran a deep audit on the file server, sir, Marcus reported quietly. The original project files weren't misplaced by Inez. They were intentionally wiped from an internal terminal using administrative credentials. Adrian leaned back in his leather chair, his expression hardening. It wasn't an internal mistake, was it? No, sir, Marcus confirmed. The login signature traces back to an old credential associated with your father's former business associate, the one trying to sabotage the upcoming board vote. So they have officially launched their offensive, Adrian murmured quietly. They are growing desperate. The very next morning, Valeria was formally called into the executive office. The news spread through the company like wildfire. Valeria had been terminated from her position immediately, without public scandal, but with absolute firmness. That evening, as Inez and Adrian walked out of the corporate tower toward their awaiting car, a soft, cold Virginia rain began to fall. They walked side by side in silence for a few moments before Inez finally broke the quiet. "You really didn't have to defend me like that back there," Inez said softly, looking at the rain hitting the pavement. "Or give me a platform to present my design." "Yes, I did," Adrian answered without hesitation. "No one in my company, or in my life, has the right to treat you as if you are lesser." Inez lowered her head, a small, genuine smile appearing on her lips. "Doing that is only going to make people like Valeria hate me even more." "Then they will simply have to learn how to hate you in silence," Adrian replied smoothly. As she looked at him, walking beside her in the rain, carrying himself with that quiet strength she had come to rely on, Inez felt a strange, terrifying realization wash over her. She was actively starting to trust this man, and that trust terrified her more than anything else in the world. The private art gallery in downtown Richmond was filled with warm, ambient lighting, low classical music, and the soft, polite murmurs of wealthy patrons. Well-dressed men and women moved fluidly across the polished hardwood floors, sipping expensive wine and admiring rare paintings as if each canvas held a profound, hidden secret. Inez walked slowly alongside Adrian, feeling entirely out of her element in such an opulent environment, yet experiencing a strange sense of comfort simply by having him near her. She couldn't fully comprehend the shift in her feelings over the past few weeks, but she no longer tried to fight it. "You really do not have to stay if this environment makes you uncomfortable," Adrian mentioned softly, turning his head toward her. "No, I want to stay," Inez replied earnestly. "There is something listed in tonight's auction catalog that I desperately need to see with my own eyes." They navigated slowly through the crowd until Inez suddenly stopped dead in her tracks. Her breath caught in her throat, and her hand instinctively flew to her mouth. There, hanging under a focused spotlight on the main gallery wall, was the painting. The vibrant brush strokes, the delicate interplay of light and shadow, the unmistakable signature in the bottom corner. There was absolutely no doubt. It was the very last canvas her mother had completed just weeks before she fell ill and passed away. For a long moment, Inez stood completely frozen, tears brimming in her eyes. It is really here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "That is my mother's painting." "Are you entirely sure?" Adrian asked quietly, his tone dropping into a serious register. "Yes, beyond a shadow of a doubt." Inez nodded slowly, wiped a tear from her cheek. "My family sold it off years ago, right after she died. They told me it was lost forever. They wanted to erase every trace of her memory from that house. Then it belongs here no longer," Adrian stated firmly. A short while later, the auction official took the podium, and the bidding for the evening's featured lots began. The numbers climbed rapidly as wealthy collectors threw out astronomical sums with casual indifference. When her mother's painting was brought to the stage, the opening bid was set at $50,000. $100,000! A voice called out from the front row. $200,000! Another bidder countered instantly. Inez felt a tight, agonizing knot form in her chest. The numbers were escalating far beyond anything she could ever dream of affording in her entire lifetime. "I can't. I will never be able to get it back," she choked out softly. "It is impossible." Stay calm, Adrian whispered beside her. He raised his hand calmly. $500,000. Inez turned to him in absolute shock, her eyes wide with disbelief. Adrian, what are you doing? You cannot spend that kind of money on a painting. Adrian did not respond to her panic. Across the room, a tall, distinguished man with silver hair and a cold, calculating expression watched them intently. It was Richard Vance, Adrian's estranged uncle, and the former vice chairman, who had been ousted from the company years ago. $1 million, Richard called out smoothly, raising his paddle while keeping his sharp, icy eyes locked directly onto Adrian. A collective gasp echoed through the elite crowd. People began turning their heads, sensing the intense personal feud unfolding beneath the surface of the auction. 1,500,000, Adrian countered without a single second of hesitation. $2 million, Richard bid instantly, a cruel smirk appearing on his face. The room fell into an absolute breathless silence. The auctioneer held his gavel high in the air, looking around the gallery. $2 million going once, going twice? $3 million, Adrian announced calmly, his voice ringing clearly across the gallery. Richard's smirk vanished instantly. He glared at Adrian, hesitated for a moment, and finally lowered his paddle in defeat. Sold to the gentleman in the front for $3 million, the auctioneer declared, slamming the wooden gavel down. Inez felt completely overwhelmed. As they finalized the paperwork in the private back room, she reached out and gently touched the wooden frame of the canvas, her fingers tracing the texture of her mother's work. "You shouldn't have spent a fortune on this," she whispered, looking at Adrian with intense gratitude and confusion. "Why would you do something like that for me?" "Because some things in this life possess a value that money cannot measure," Adrian answered softly. "And because it needed to return to the person who actually loves it." When they stepped out of the gallery into the cool, damp Richmond night, the city streets were quiet and glistening from a recent rainfall. "Thank you," Inez said, her voice filled with deep emotion. "I don't even know how I will ever repay you for this." "You don't owe me anything, Inez," he replied gently. Suddenly, the peaceful atmosphere was shattered by the sound of heavy, rapid footsteps approaching from the shadows of an alleyway. A figure dressed in dark clothing lunged forward out of nowhere, aiming a violent strike directly at the side of Inez's head in an attempt to grab the wrapped canvas from her arms. Everything happened in a fraction of a second. But before the attacker's fist could make contact, Adrian moved, not like a blind man relying on sound, but with blinding, superhuman speed and absolute visual precision. He lunged forward, grabbed the attacker's wrist mid-air, twisted his arm back with incredible force, and shoved the assailant against the brick wall before the man could even react. The mugger let out a grunt of pain, dropped a small knife onto the pavement, and scrambled away into the darkness. Inez stood completely frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs, her eyes wide with horror, not at the attacker, but at her husband. She watched as Adrian stood tall, his posture perfect, his eyes tracking the fleeing man with absolute flawless vision before turning his gaze directly to look at her. "You," Inez whispered, her voice choking in her throat, as the terrifying realization struck her like a physical blow. "You can see." Adrian stood perfectly still under the warm glow of the street lamp, his dark glasses hanging loose in his hand. The heavy silence between them transformed instantly, filling with a crushing, suffocating tension. "How long?" Inez demanded, her voice cracking as tears of betrayal spilled down her cheeks. Since when can you see? Inez, please, listen to me, Adrian pleaded, taking a step toward her. It is not what it looks like. It is exactly what it looks like, she cried out, backing away from him as if he were a dangerous stranger. You lied to me. You lied to everyone. You let me pity you. You let me worry about you. You let my family treat you like an invalid. All while you were secretly watching every single thing I did. I was trying to protect you, Adrian insisted, his voice laced with desperate urgency. Protect me? Inez let out a bitter, heartbroken laugh. Or were you just using me as part of some sick, twisted game? I actually trusted you, Adrian. I was starting to believe in us. Inez, there are dangerous forces at play here that you do not understand, he tried to explain, taking another step forward. I couldn't tell you the truth, not while everything was still on the line. Stay away from me, she yelled, wrapping her arms tightly around her mother's painting. I don't know who you are, and I don't care about your games anymore. I am leaving. Without waiting for his response, Inez turned on her heel and ran down the wet sidewalk into the night, clutching the canvas to her chest. Adrian did not chase after her. He stood under the dim street lamp, his eyes filled with profound regret and pain, knowing that no amount of explanations could undo the damage caused by his deception. A short distance away, parked inside a black SUV with tinted windows, Richard Vance watched the entire scene unfold through a pair of binoculars. A sinister, cold smile spread across his face as he picked up his phone. The girl has isolated herself, Richard spoke into the receiver, and our dear nephew has finally shown his true colors. Move in now. It is time to finish this, once and for all. The danger reached Inez far faster than she could have ever anticipated. She was walking rapidly through a quiet, dimly lit residential neighborhood, her mind swirling with feelings of betrayal, anger, and heartbreak, when an unmarked black van pulled up alongside her and screeched to a halt. Before she could even scream for help, the sliding side door burst open. Two heavy-set men in dark jackets rushed out, grabbed her forcefully by the arms, shoved a chemical-soaked rag over her face, and threw her into the back of the vehicle. Within seconds, her vision went completely black. When Inez finally regained consciousness, the crisp night air of Richmond was gone, replaced by a cold, damp draft and the heavy metallic smell of rust and old concrete. She found herself tied securely to a wooden chair inside a vast, abandoned industrial warehouse located down near the James River. Every small sound echoed loudly off the high corrugated metal walls. Ah, so our guest of honor is finally awake, a cold, smooth voice echoed from the darkness. Richard Vance stepped into the pool of light hanging above her, carrying himself with an air of absolute control. Behind him stood two armed guards, along with Maya, the young housemaid from the estate, who kept her eyes fixed firmly on the ground. Inez glared at him, her body shaking from fear and cold, but her spirit refusing to break. You are Adrian's uncle. What do you want from me? What I want, my dear Inez, is simply what was stolen from me 5 years ago, Richard replied smoothly, pacing around her chair. Your husband and his late father built an empire on my back, and then pushed me out when I became inconvenient. For 5 long years, Adrian played the pathetic, blind victim, hiding behind his fake disability while secretly undermining my operations. But you are his single, greatest weakness. Inez sneered, pulling against the ropes binding her wrists. You are wrong. He doesn't care about me. Our marriage was just a business arrangement. Is that so? Richard chuckled cruelly. A man does not throw away $3 million on a worthless piece of canvas for a woman he doesn't care about. He will come for you, and when he does, he will sign over his voting shares in Vance Enterprises, or he will watch you pay the ultimate price. Meanwhile, back at the estate, chaos had erupted. Marcus stood in the main security command center, monitoring a dozen screens while tracking a GPS ping. Adrian stood beside him, his expression darker and more formidable than anyone had ever seen before. All traces of the gentle, quiet man had vanished, replaced by an unstoppable force of nature. "We tracked the van to the abandoned ironworks facility by the docks, sir," Marcus reported urgently. "It is definitely a setup. Richard knows you can see, and he has at least 6 armed men waiting inside. Going in there without waiting for federal backup is absolute suicide." "I am not waiting for backup," Adrian said, his voice dropping into an icy, terrifying tone. "Prepare the vehicles. We leave right now." 20 minutes later, the heavy metal doors of the warehouse were kicked open with a deafening crash. Adrian stepped into the cavernous building completely alone, walking steadily down the center aisle into the bright glare of work lights that Richard had set up. "You actually came," Richard called out from an elevated walkway above, a triumphant grin on his face. "And look at you, walking without a cane, looking straight at me. The great miracle of the Vance family." Down below, tied to the chair, Inez looked up in absolute horror. "Adrian, no! It's a trap! Get out of here!" Adrian's eyes locked onto Inez, checking her quickly for any physical injuries. Seeing that she was unhurt, a visible wave of relief passed over his face before he turned his attention back to his uncle. "Let her go, Richard," Adrian demanded, his voice ringing through the massive space with absolute authority. "This fight is between you and me. She has nothing to do with this family's past. She has everything to do with it now," Richard shouted back, waving a thick stack of legal documents in the air. "Sign these transfer papers, relinquishing all your holdings and voting rights to me, and I will let both of you walk out of here alive. Refuse, and neither of you leaves this building tonight." Adrian reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a pen, and slowly approached the wooden table sitting in the center of the floor. "You want the company, Richard? You can have it. I don't care about the board, I don't care about the shares, and I certainly don't care about the money. Take it all." Richard frowned, slightly thrown off by how quickly Adrian was yielding. "Sign it, then." As Adrian bent over the table and clicked the pen, Richard let out a loud, mocking laugh. "Did you really think you could fool me for 5 years, Adrian? Did you honestly believe that pretending to be blind would keep you safe from me forever?" Adrian paused, the pen hovering just above the signature line. He slowly lifted his head, looking directly into his uncle's eyes. "I didn't pretend to be blind to fool you, Richard," Adrian said, his voice terrifyingly calm. 5 years ago, after the car accident that killed my father, I did lose my vision almost completely. For 2 years, I was living in total darkness. But when my sight gradually began to return after multiple surgeries, I realized something important. As long as everyone believed I was helpless, you and your conspirators would feel safe enough to reveal yourselves." Inez listened intently, her breath catching in her throat, as the full, complex truth finally laid itself bare before her. "I stayed in the dark on purpose," Adrian continued, his voice echoing off the concrete walls, "so I could observe every snake in my company without them ever knowing I was watching. I was waiting for the exact moment you made your move." "It doesn't matter anymore," Richard sneered, motioning for his guards to raise their weapons. "You are outmatched and cornered." Am I? Adrian replied coolly. Suddenly, loud sirens blared outside the warehouse as red and blue lights flashed wildly through the dirty windows. Heavy steel doors on all sides were breached simultaneously as armed federal agents and local police officers poured into the building. FBI! Nobody move! Drop your weapons immediately! Tactical officers screamed, their laser sights painting the room in red dots. Chaos erupted. Richard's hired guards instantly threw their hands in the air, dropping their weapons onto the concrete floor. Richard tried to scramble toward the emergency exit, but Marcus burst through a side door and tackled him forcefully to the ground, pinning his arms behind his back and snapping handcuffs onto his wrists. While the police secured the scene, Adrian paid no attention to the commotion around him. He ran straight toward Inez, pulling out a pocket knife and quickly slicing through the heavy ropes binding her wrists and ankles. "Inez, are you all right? Did they hurt you?" he asked frantically, his hands shaking as he helped her stand up. Inez looked at him, her chest heaving as she processed everything that had just occurred. She looked into his eyes, the eyes that had kept such a heavy, crushing secret for so long, and saw nothing but genuine, unfiltered fear for her safety. "I am fine," she whispered softly. Just then, two federal agents escorted Maya, the young maid, toward the exit. She paused near Inez, her head hanging low in deep shame. "I am so sorry, Mrs. Vance," Maya wept softly. "They threatened my family. I had no choice. I gave them the key to the painting's frame." Inez frowned in confusion. "The frame?" Adrian walked over to the wooden table where the recovered painting sat. He carefully turned the heavy canvas around, pressed a small, hidden release catch along the thick mahogany edge, and pulled away a false wooden backing. Inside a sealed, moisture-proof plastic sleeve lay a thick stack of original, signed legal documents and land deeds. "Your mother didn't just paint, Inez," Adrian explained gently, handing the documents to her. "Before she died, she knew my uncle and your aunt were trying to illegally seize her family's property and patents. She hid the original deeds and proof of ownership inside the backing of her final painting to protect your future. Everything your family stole from you. It is all right here. It was always yours." Inez held the documents against her chest, a flood of emotional realization washing over her. The painting hadn't just been a memory of her mother. It was her mother's final, brilliant shield protecting her from beyond the grave. And Adrian had spent millions of dollars, risked his company, and exposed his deepest secret just to return it to her. "Why?" Inez asked, tears streaming down her face as she looked up at Adrian. "Why did you go through all of this for me?" Adrian looked at her, his expression filled with a profound, vulnerable warmth that completely undid her. "Because 6 years ago, right after the car crash that took my father's life and left me blind in the burning wreckage on Route 29, a young girl pulled over her beaten-up truck, forced open my jammed car door, and pulled me out of the flames just seconds before the gas tank exploded." Inez gasped, her hands flying to her mouth as a long-buried memory rushed back to her with absolute clarity. "I never got to see her face that night because my eyes were damaged by the heat," Adrian continued, his voice thick with emotion. "And she ran away before the paramedics arrived because she was terrified. But I never, ever forgot her voice. For 6 long years, I searched everywhere for the girl who saved my life. And the moment you spoke your very first sentence in your aunt's living room in Oak Haven, I knew it was you." The silence that fell over the space was no longer heavy or threatening. It was filled with a deep, healing truth that reconnected two broken lives. "You lied to me, Adrian," Inez said softly. wiping a tear from her cheek. "I did," Adrian admitted openly, taking her hands in his, "and I will spend the rest of my life earning back your forgiveness if you will let me. No more secrets, no more contracts, no more lies." Inez looked down at their joined hands, feeling the warmth and strength of his grip. She knew that trust was not something that could be restored overnight, but as she looked into the eyes of the man who had protected her mother's legacy and risked everything to save her, she knew they had found something real amidst all the deception. "No more lies," she agreed softly, a tender smile breaking through her tears. A year had passed since that fateful stormy night near the Richmond docks. The crisp, golden air of late autumn had returned to the hills of Virginia, painting the trees in brilliant shades of amber, crimson, and deep gold. The Vance estate was no longer a quiet, solemn mansion filled with dark secrets and hidden surveillance. It had transformed into a warm, vibrant home filled with life, laughter, and light. The thick, dark curtains that once blocked the sun had been replaced with sheer white fabrics that allowed the warm morning light to flood every corner of the house. The grand living room now displayed vibrant architectural models and colorful oil paintings, creating an atmosphere that felt truly alive. Inez stood in the center of her brand-new, light-filled art studio on the second floor of the estate, holding a palette covered in rich oil paints. Hanging proudly in the place of honor above the fireplace was her mother's restored painting, its colors glowing brilliantly under the soft afternoon light. A gentle knock sounded at the door before Adrian walked into the room. He was walking effortlessly, wearing a warm charcoal sweater and carrying 2 hot mugs of coffee. He set one down on her work table, stepped up behind her, and gently rested his hands on her waist, pulling her close against his chest. "How is the new design coming along?" he asked softly, resting his chin on her shoulder as he looked at the grand architectural canvas she was working on. "It is coming along wonderfully," Inez replied, leaning back against him with a deep sense of peace. The community housing project downtown broke ground this morning, and the city council approved our second phase without a single objection. "I never had a doubt," Adrian smiled, kissing her cheek softly. "You have given this company, and my life, a vision it never had before." Inez turned in his arms, wrapping her hands around his neck and looking deep into his clear, loving eyes. They had both carried profound scars from their pasts. She from the emotional neglect of a family that treated her as disposable, and he from the heavy burden of betrayal, loss, and constant vigilance. Yet, through the messy, painful process of uncovering truths and dismantling lies, they had managed to build a sanctuary together where neither of them ever had to hide again. As they stood together by the wide studio window, looking out over the peaceful, sunlit grounds of the estate, Inez felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought them to this moment. Life had not offered them a simple or easy path, but it had given them something far more valuable: the courage to heal, the strength to forgive, and the profound joy of building a true home together. Looking back upon the winding journey of Inez and Adrian, one is quietly reminded of a profound truth that resonates deeply with the human experience, particularly for those who have weathered the long seasons of life. We often find ourselves walking through chapters we did not choose, bearing the heavy weight of unfair circumstances, broken promises, and the quiet grief of lost time. In our darkest moments, when life seems reduced to mere survival, it is easy to believe that our stories have already been written and that the future holds little more than the lingering shadows of our past painful experiences. Yet, as the years teach us, the human heart possesses an extraordinary, quiet capacity for renewal. True healing rarely arrives wrapped in perfect circumstances or pristine packages. More often than not, it begins amidst the rubble of our broken expectations. It requires of us a profound kind of courage, the bravery to look past the lies we have been told, the willingness to lay down our defensive armor, and the radical decision to extend forgiveness even when the wounds run deep. Forgiveness is not about erasing the past or pretending that pain never existed. Rather, it is the conscious choice to release the stranglehold that past betrayals hold over our future, allowing something new and beautiful to grow in soil that was once barren. In a world that so often measures success by wealth, status, and external perfection, this story gently reminds us that the true riches of this life are found in the quiet, unseen spaces between people. They are found in the silent sacrifices made to protect another's dignity, in the unyielding commitment to stand by someone when the storm reaches its peak, and in the profound grace of choosing to build a life anchored in honesty and selflessness. Love, in its purest and most enduring form, is not a fleeting emotion or a convenient arrangement. It is a daily, deliberate choice to see the inherent value in another person and to offer them a safe place to land. For anyone currently carrying the quiet burden of an unresolved past or standing at the crossroads of a difficult beginning, let this journey serve as a gentle beacon of hope. No heart is ever too broken to be restored. No past is too heavy to be redeemed. And no person is ever too far gone to find a place where they truly belong. Sometimes, the very detours and trials we fear the most are simply the quiet ways through which life prepares us to recognize genuine goodness when it finally arrives. In the end, the willingness to choose kindness over bitterness, truth over deception, and love over fear remains the single greatest legacy we can ever leave behind. A timeless reminder that as long as we have the breath to choose again, it is never, ever too late to begin anew.